1. Job chapter 1, verses 6 through 12 from the New Living Translation reads this way. One day the members of the heavenly court came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser, Satan, came with them. Where have you come from? The Lord asked Satan. Satan answered the Lord, I've been patrolling the earth, watching everything that's going on. Then the Lord asked Satan, have you noticed my servant Job? He's the finest man in all of the earth. He is blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil. Satan replied to the Lord, yes, but Job has good reason to fear God. You have always put a wall of protection around him and his home and his property. You've made him prosper in everything he does. Look how rich he is. But reach out and take away everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. Verse 12, all right, you may test him, the Lord said to Satan. Do whatever you want with everything he possesses, but don't harm him physically. So Satan left the Lord's presence. Today, I want to use as a topic, which is going to be the theme for this series, is this your king? Is this your king? Let's take a second to pray and we'll jump straight into it. God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this moment, this opportunity, this time. God, we pray that you'll sanctify this preaching moment. God, I pray that this moment will not just be used for inspiration, but also for education, not just for inspiration and education, but also for transformation. And so, God, as you continue to change us, as you continue to move us and shift us and mold us into who you've created us to be, we're going to give you all the glory, all the honor, and all the praise. It's your thing. Do what you want to do. These and all things in Christ's name. Amen. Amen. The book of Job represents a clash between theology and human experience. A clash between, now some of these words may be big, but you'll get it here in a second. It's a clash. It's an intersection between theology, your view of God, what you know about God, and human experience, what you've experienced thus far. It's the juxtaposition, it's the intersection, it's the place where these two parts meet between what you have been taught about God and what you know about God from experience. And I believe the best way to sum up how sometimes there can be an inconsistency between what we expect and what actually is can be summed up based off of a line in one of the best movies I've been blessed to see in my lifetime by the name of The Black Panther. Yeah, I know. It didn't come out in 2020, but I know y'all were there at the movie theater, watched it 3 or 4 times, like some of the people who I know did. The Black Panther, it was a blockbuster. It was a huge movie, and there was a moment that became popularized by memes on social media, and this moment is when Eric Killmonger is fighting T'Challa, who we know as the Black Panther, and the Black Panther kept falling down. And so Killmonger yelled out a phrase that took social media by storm. And I want to bring this quote, this phrase live to your living room. And if you remember it and you feel it the same way you did the first time when I say it, I dare you to type it. He told him this phrase after Killmonger, the antagonist, seems to defeat the person who's the king. He looks at the audience, he looks at all the people who live there in Wakanda and asks them this question: is this your king? Is this your king? Killmonger asks the question, is this your king? Killmonger understands that the king has fallen, and so he begs the question, how is this your king? Watch this, when your king looks like this. How is this your king when your king looks like this? At the time, the king was on his knees crying because he just got his uncle killed. The king was on his knees hurting because he was getting beat up by the person who's supposed to be the bad guy. And so then the antagonist, the bad guy, turns around and asks the people of Wakanda, is this what a king looks like? And so the antagonist begins to torment the people based on the appearance of the king. And if you're honest, this ain't for everybody, but this is just for the honest people. Sometimes it seems like the enemy is making a valid point. It's not for everybody, but sometimes the antagonist, sometimes it seems like the enemy, sometimes even the devil, it seems to just make a little bit more sense than God does at times. And so sometimes we even have to ask ourselves, King, if you're a king, T'Challa, if you're a king, why are you taking punches? Shouldn't a king be able to avoid taking punches? If you're a king, why are you picking yourself up off the ground? If you're a king, why are people dying when you have the ability to protect your people? Why does it appear that a king is taking an L? And so Killmonger asks this question, is this your king? Job wrestles with the question of what a king, or come here, what God looks like in the midst of human suffering. You may remember that this isn't the only time that we hear something similar to this. It was Job who had to wrestle with the question of whether God was his king in the middle of suffering. It was Jesus who was asked the question by the crowd, is this your king? Is this king of the king? When he says he can save everybody else but can't get himself off of the cross. And at some point, I want to suggest that even the voice of the enemy begins to make sense. But I want to deposit something in the middle of the mess that we're going through, that we know and we've called and we have coined 2020. The year after 2019 and the year before 2021, the year we're in right now that doesn't make any sense. In 2020, many of us are in the middle of suffering, and we have to ask ourselves this question. Is this your king? No, I'm not talking about T'Challa, not talking about the Black Panther right now. I'm talking about the God that you know, the God that you've learned, the God that you have been taught, the God that you praise, the God that you thank for all the ways that he made. In the middle of suffering, sometimes you have to ask yourself the question, is this my king? In the middle of the pandemic, policing, and protest, is this my king? In the middle of death, doom, and danger, is this your king? Matter of fact, somebody's asking the question, not is this the king, but where in the world is the king? Because sometimes it's hard to recognize, it's hard to point out God in the middle of problems in which it seems like God can stop, but God chose not to. And you'll be left with this question, is this my king? And so Job is a book that deals with human suffering. That's why many people don't really like to open it, or we jump to the end. We don't like to sit with the beginning, because the beginning and the first 40-some chapters of Job are all about human suffering. And the God that we know and all the rest of the Bible is not present in the same way in Job as God was in Genesis. God is not present in the same way in Deuteronomy and Leviticus as God is. We're going to get to it in the series, as God is here in Job. God does not seem like the same God in the New Testament as God does in Job, because what we have been taught up to this point, scholars, more recent scholarship suggests that Job is actually the last book written of the Old Testament. And so it's been written after Genesis. There's debate, but I fall on this side of the argument. It's been written after Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all of the codes, all of the history books. And so for all intents and purposes, this book is written as a critique of how simple God is presented in all the other books. Watch this. Now look, if you're looking for elementary school, you're looking for baby food, I don't have any for you this series. This series is for the people who's saying, look, they've been giving me a version of God and it sounds good, it's palatable, I can eat it, I can digest it, but at the end of the day, it doesn't always work for what I'm going with. And that is what the author of Job is trying to get at. This isn't for the shallow Christians, this is for the ones who are trying to learn how to swim. At the end of the day, the God that's in Genesis does not look like the God that's in Job, and that is because the God in Genesis seems all powerful. The God in Genesis is able to make everything out of nothing. The God in Genesis is able to speak and things start moving. And then you get to Job and all of a sudden people are suffering and it seems like God is silent. All of a sudden you get to Job and the God who did all that speaking in the first few books of the Bible is now not speaking as much in Job. And Job is written as a critique of the books that attempted to make God simple. the books that oversimplified God. We'll get to this later in the series, but it was the priestly writers said that the reason why bad things happen to us is because we did not keep the temple clean. And then you have the Levitical and the Deuteronomistic writers. They say that the reason that we went through trouble and turmoil, the reason that we suffered was because we did not keep God's laws and God's commandments. Then you have the prophets. They said the reason why we go through turmoil and problems is because we did not uphold justice. And so one school of thought says it was the temple. The other school of thought says it was disobedient. The other school of thought says that we just didn't do justly. And here Job is, and Job is a critique. Job is a book that says those are not incorrect, but they could be incomplete. Meaning that it does not mean that they're wrong, but if the only version of God that you have comes from those answers, you have committed a crime, and that is you have tried to dumb down God to human understanding, when at the end of the day, God is always going to be bigger than whatever you can come up with. God is always going to be bigger than whatever your personal experience was. And I don't know about you, that's scary for some people, but for people like me who know God to be bigger and know God to be better, that's good news. Because I'm comforted by scriptures that say that my ways are not his ways and my thoughts and his thoughts are not my thoughts. I'm comforted by scriptures that remind me that God is able to do exceeding and abundantly. And if you believe that God to be true, then you also have to admit that there are many times where we tried to put an answer and a label on God that did not fit. And it leaves us asking the question many times in the middle of suffering, is this your king? Because Job represents a person whose religion did not embody all of the complexities of God. Watch this. It's going to start making sense right here. Job represents a person whose religion that was given to him does not embody how complex and how nuanced and how big God really is. Can I show you how the author sets this up? There's multiple times in one chapter. Anytime you see something repeated over and over again, it's for a reason. The way we're introduced to Job, King James language says it this way: Job was blameless and Job was upright. There's a reason that the author keeps wanting to tell us that Job is blameless and Job is upright, because the author knows that as many times as he can repeat that phrase, there's going to be other people who are going to repetitively ask the question, is he going through suffering because of something he did? So the author writes it again: Job is blameless and Job is upright. And so it shows us that not only is he blameless and upright, but Job sacrificed. Job offered unto God, not just for himself. This is why I know he was religious. He did it for his kids. He offered for himself. He offered for his kids. He stayed around things about God and love and stayed away from evil. This is summarizing the first few verses of chapter 1. And then all of the sudden, the religion that he was introduced to is now being put to the test, because the religion that he was giving did not encompass the experience that he's about to feel, the suffering that he's about to go to. And you've got to be careful, because if you're too married to your religion, yes, I'm talking to you. If you're too married to your religion and you're not married enough to God, if you're married to the religion, what people have told you about God, what you've learned about God through third person experience, and you're not married enough to the relationship and the first person encounters with God, you will get in trouble, because religion, I hate to say it, religion is not always right. I love the song, Give Me That Old Time Religion, but religion is not always right. You do know that it is religion that was used to perpetuate a system that says that women are less than men, and then men try to fix it up and say, well, they're not less than, but Paul said it. I'm not saying that Paul said it. Paul said because they messed up in the garden, and because it was Eve's fault, that's why they're not less than, but they're just less in the hierarchy. And they conveniently ignore all the other scriptures. They talk about the first Adam, don't talk about the second Adam, because religion has been used. They don't talk about that there's no more male nor nor female, no bond nor slave. No, they don't talk about any of that because religion has not learned that you can use the Bible to make it say whatever you want to. And so religion has created a system that tells women that they're less than and that they are not equal to, or they are not created to be equals with men. It's also religion that taught us that when you talk about religion, you talk about God, but you don't talk about politics. That's why I'm glad that I believe we're in the season that we're in now, because right in the middle of the pandemic, we also run into some bad police. And in the middle of pandemic and police, we run into a series of protests. And it seems like the pandemic that taught us that God, that your relationship with God is about more than the four walls of the church building. In the middle of it, it seems like God asks us this question: have you learned your lesson? And so God is trying to figure out whether his children are going to actually get out here and fight for the cause, fight for the people, because we're in a season that says it's bigger than the church. And so now God gives us a test to see if you can be the church, because there's no such thing as church without politics. It's not, can we keep politics out of the church? The question is, do we have ethical politics in the church? That's another sermon for another day. It's religion that tries to get us to believe that we have the truth and everybody else has a lie, when really, that's why it's hard for us to admit when we get something wrong, because we believe if we get one thing wrong, we got everything wrong. And so religion, many of us were saved because we believe that we're the people, we're the church, we're them, we're the ones. Everybody else is lost, because religion has a way of trying to tell you that you have the truth when everybody else has a lie. It's religion that taught you that God always has an answer, and that if you have a question and you don't have the answer, ask somebody and somebody should be able to give it to you like that, when it's not true. Religion says that you always should have an answer for the things you're living through, when it's actually relationship that says that sometimes God doesn't give you an answer, but God makes you live the question. It's religion that has taught children of God to hate gay people and call them an abomination without realizing that there's God in your neighbor, whether you agree with how they live or not. It's religion that has taught many people for generations to accept slavery and to explain slavery, when really slavery was never a part of God's plan. God created a whole book called the Exodus to show that he is against anything that does not liberate his people. But it was religion that taught us that slavery was acceptable. It was religion that taught us to normalize suffering. That's why we're silent about issues such as domestic violence and rape and all these things that need to be spoken of, because we believe that if Jesus suffered a bad death, that we need to live a bad life. But I've come to tell somebody that the notion that you need to suffer to live is just religion. And it was religion that taught us to demonize divorce while ignoring the fact that some people were married to the devil prior to the divorce. I'm not anti-religion, but what I'm trying to tell you is Job has ran into the same thing that many of us have ran into, and that is that the religion that he was given did not match the experience that God just placed him in. Look, I just summed up my last 4 or 5 years of living. I remember, I can go further back than that actually, going to school and all the things that I was told God is and is not, and then I experienced things for myself, and I'm like, now wait a second. What I was taught is not matching up with what God is showing me. And at some point, you are going to have to deal. You're going to feel like Job, because what you've been told does not always line up with what you learn about God for yourself. So watch this, because we're about to get to the good part. Watch this. Job is a book that talks about how, for the entire Old Testament just about, there's this notion, there's this belief, and we're going to dive into this later, that if you're going through suffering, it's your fault. Watch this. And many of you know it's true, because people have told you the same thing. Job is a book that deals with the notion that if you're suffering, you need to figure out what you did that was wrong. And so Job is really a book about theodicy. Type this in, theodicy, Theodicy, theodicy. Theodicy. I tell you to say it, but right now I'm going to tell you to spell it and type it in, theodicy. Theodicy deals with this question: why do bad things happen to good people? And so when we talk about the Black Panther and the question of, is this your king? We're dealing with theodicy, because what we're trying to figure out is, how can a good God allow bad things to happen? We're trying to deal with, how can I be going through something that's so bad and somebody tell me that something I did is what caused that to happen? When we talk about theodicy, these are situations that do not cause us to throw the idea of God away, but it does make us have to separate the real from the fake. And so when we talk about, is this your king? I want to lift up as this example as I give you the 2 points and the lesson will be yours. This is just the outline. It's going to get even better. There's a lady by the name of Nancy Ambrose. This is Howard Thurman's grandmother. And so Nancy Ambrose was a slave. Howard Thurman was a great theologian, preacher, thinker. And so his grandmother tore out all of the books that Paul wrote from her Bible. Watch this. Nancy Ambrose, Howard Thurman's grandmother, was a slave, lived through slavery, and got so tired of hearing the slave master use Paul to condone slavery that she decided she was going to rip all of the books that Paul wrote out of the Bible. And so Howard Thurman eventually asked her, why did you tear all of Paul's books out of the Bible? You know that's a big chunk of the Bible. Why did you throw all the Paul's books out of the Bible? Look, this is for the people who can handle it. She said, because the God that they were teaching me through the words of Paul on the plantation was not the God that I know for myself. Can I tell you why I think this series is going to bless somebody? Not because it's always going to make you feel good, not because it's going to make you shout the entire time, but because for somebody, this series is going to help you realize that the God that they introduced to you is not the God that you know for yourself. It does not mean that it was wrong, but it just might mean that it was incomplete. And so I've got to ask you this question. The God that they introduced to you, is that your king? And so we're talking about theodicy. Let me get to it. There's 2 points I want to deal with here from the text. My time is already up. There's 2 things that theodicy shows us with regards to the question, is this your king? Point number 1, theodicy reveals your motive. Theodicy reveals your motive. When you get some time, look back up at the text. It's real weird because it seems like God and the devil are cool. God and Satan are cool. Now that's the first thing that should trouble you. Why in the world is the devil, why in the world is Satan and God kicking it at the same place? Why is it that Satan and God got each other's phone number, got each other's address, and Satan can just walk into a meeting with heavenly beings? And so not only does Satan do this, not only is it weird that God and Satan are hanging out at the same time, but after they're hanging out at the same time, then all of a sudden there's a conversation that breaks out. And so he asked Satan, what are you doing? He said, I've just been walking around, seeing what's going on the earth. I've just been kicking it, causing a little trouble here and there, not too much. And so all of a sudden, Job's name comes up. And he says, well, have you considered my servant Job? He's blameless and upright. God knows that he's blameless and upright, it seems like. He said, have you considered my servant Job? And Satan says, yeah, I've considered him, but there's a problem. The reason that I haven't been able to do anything with him is because you have a hedge of protection around him. If I had time, I'd spend just a few seconds on the fact that there were some people that were trying to get to you, but they found out as soon as they tried to strike that you were protected. Yeah, I'm talking about like password on your phone. You're going to have to guess it in order to get in here. God has been protecting you, but I don't even have time to deal with that. He says you put a hedge of protection around him. That's why I cannot get to him. And so he said, look, if Satan puts on a wager, a bet. As a matter of fact, let me give you this. This is actually one of the few times in the entire Old Testament that we even run into the word Satan. I think it's 3 times total. And it's the word Hasatan. And many people believe that this author may have created the concept of Satan to try to understand where evil originates from. I don't have time to get into it, but sometimes I want to give it to you to say this. Sometimes we give Satan too much credit. Sometimes we give Satan credit for things, more credit than we do God at times. We give Satan too much credit. And so some people believe that Satan is an invention of the author to try to figure out where evil comes from. And so really Satan in the text just means one word, accuser. And so there's an accuser. There's somebody who's walking around accusing, making accusations. And watch what the accuser does. The accuser makes an accusation. He looks at God and says, I would touch Job, but the problem is you have a hedge of protection around him, and makes a bet. The accuser says, if you were to move that hedge of protection, I bet he'd curse you. And so I'm giving you the Rap Junior summary. And so God says, I tell you what, I know Job. Job has a good heart. Job is not just serving me just because I'm blessing him. As a matter of fact, I'll remove the hedge of protection, Satan. And what I'll let you do is I'll let you touch him, but you just can't touch his life. And so Satan asks this question as a part of the wager. When Satan's in the middle of the accusation, here's the accusation. Does Job serve God for naught? It's the King James language. Meaning, Satan asks this question. Watch this. God, do you think that Job is serving you for no reason? You see the car that he has. You see the house that he has. You see the fact that got air conditioning in the summertime. You see how well you've blessed him. Is Job serving you for naught? Because Job, the author of Job, wants to get directly at this notion that religion has created a formula on how to pimp God. I'm going to show it to you. Religion has said things like you have not because you ask not. And if you just have a little bit of faith, you say it's going to happen. And to a certain extent, it's almost like we've turned God into a type of Santa Claus. In which when we say something, you basically tell him, like, was it ludicrous? When I move, you move, just like that. And so we believe when we pray it, we put the blood on it and we decree and declare it and we blab it and grab it. And so after we do all that, then God has to do God's part and God has to do what we said. And so Satan asks this question: God, does Job love you because you're good to him, or does Job love you just because he loves you? Come here. Do you love God just when the bills are paid, or can you love God when all of a sudden the money ain't adding up at the end of the month? Do you believe that you love God when things are going, when the sun is out, or can you also love God when the bottom falls out? And so the question that I have to ask you, I'm not the accuser, but I think it's worth asking when we talk about kingship, because the Odyssey reveals your motive. Satan asks God, does Job serve you for naught? Which means, I bet if I test him, you can reveal what his motive is. Because if I test them, all of a sudden, all the religion that they've been taught is now put to the test. If I test him, all of a sudden, all the things that people told him about you is being put to the test. And so at some point, the Odyssey, suffering, will bring you to this conclusion: God is sovereign, meaning that there are times that God moves on behalf of his children, but there's never a time where a king has to step off of his throne to do what his people tell him to do. There are going to be times where you pray for healing and the healing never happens. There are going to be times where you pray for mended relationships and the relationship never comes back. There are going to be times where you call God a provider, and all of a sudden, right after you call God a provider and saw him provide for your neighbor, you realize that God did not provide for you the way that you thought God was going to provide for you. And if you have been taught that God blesses people who have been behaving themselves, God only blesses people who are his children, then you are going to be put into a situation that we call theodicy. And you're going to have to wrestle with the notion of the king that you've been introduced and the king that you are now coming to grips with. Because Job teaches us that some tests are brought to reveal your motive. What is the reason that you really love God? Can you love God, bro? Can you love God when the house is gone, the car is gone? Can you love God when you're in Job's shoes and all of a sudden all that you knew before has changed? Can you love God in the middle of a pandemic? In the middle of seems like the United States on fire? Watch this. Point number one, theodicy reveals your motive. But point number two, and this is it. This is all the time I got for you. Theodicy reveals your expectation of a king. Now watch this. This is important because Killmonger is, if you remember the scene, Killmonger has now defeated. It seems like he's defeated T'Challa, and so T'Challa's gone, the uncle is gone, and he asks this question: "Is this your king?" And he's messing with their image of a king, because really the question that's being asked is, do you believe a king is a king only when good things are happening? Come here. Can you believe is it possible to be a king if you end up on your back every once in a while? Is it possible to be a king if it seems like evil is winning and good is losing? Is it possible to be a king when all of a sudden it seems like the person who's not the king is winning, the enemy, the opposition, Satan is winning? Is it possible for God still to be God when it seems like the devil is winning? And it's messing with this notion of kingship. And can I tell you what I believe? I believe that a king does not lose his kingship just because it appears that a king is losing. I think that a king is still a king even if a king ends up on his back. Okay. Again, the biggest sin of religion is trying to oversimplify God. We assume that we know it all. That's why when people ask us, they don't know why something's going on. You try to hurry and give them answers because you did this and you did that. And so you're trying to give them a king that knows everything, a king that's strong, a king that never bends, a king that never takes a step backwards. But if you only have God that's present in the good times, then what happens when you go through bad? Because if your expectation of a king is one who's up on the throne, is all powerful and never gets his hands dirty, never touches the ground, then all of a sudden your image of a king, it comes into trouble when you run into the reality of slavery for Black people. Because what Black people are saying is, if God was really God, why didn't God get off the throne when we were being tortured for the past 400 years? If your image of a king is one that can't get his hands dirty and can't seem to take a loss but bounce back even stronger, then you're going to get in trouble when people are asking you, why is it that Christians like Hitler were the ones that were behind the Holocaust? If your image of God cannot handle God getting his hands dirty, if your image of God if your image of kingship, come here, T'Challa, cannot handle a king being put on his back but bouncing back up, then your image of God is going to fail whenever you're trying to explain to people why suffering happens on earth. Suffering is not the result of God, but suffering does not nullify God, meaning God is not just present when it's good, but God is present in the suffering with us. James Cone says that Jesus identifies with our suffering. And so I want to wrestle with the notion of whether God is only present when things are good. Watch this. Because this is the end. I'm at the end. Watch this. See, it wasn't too hard. If I can get you to understand that God is still the king when it seems like there's no king present, if I can get you to understand that God is still the king when it seems like the king is on his back and evil is winning, then I can get you to understand that it does not matter what's going on in your life, you are a king and a queen as well. I just did all this preaching and somebody just missed it. Watch this. If I can get you to understand that God was still God when Jesus was on the cross being crucified, the same way God was still God when he got Jesus up from the grave. If I can get you to understand that God was still the king even when it was dark and the earth was shaking. If I can get you to understand that God was still a king even when it didn't seem like a king was doing what a king was supposed to do, then I can get you to understand that God is not just the king when there's evil present, but I can also get you to understand that right there, and no matter what mess you are, no matter what you did yesterday, no matter what you did last week and last year, no matter what you've done this morning, this afternoon, that you are a king, you are a queen, you are royalty. Come here. You do not measure the strength of a king by how many times they fall down. You measure the strength of a king by how many times they get back up. I want to suggest to you, this series is going to blow somebody's mind because you've been taught that God is only God when things are going well. But I want to suggest that God is just as much God in the midst of death, in the midst of persecution, in the midst of people lying, in the midst of people backstabbing, in the midst of people talking about you, in the midst of whatever type of suffering, in the midst of the pandemic, in the midst of police brutality that we just saw again in Atlanta. In the middle of all of this, God is still God, and you cannot simplify what is going on. You cannot simplify what God is doing to what you can understand, because some things happen that are beyond what we can really ask or think. Some things are so evil. I'm closing, but I'm gonna give you this. I remember people were saying that Hurricane Katrina chose New Orleans because New Orleans has Mardi Gras, and they got the the streets. You know they got all this going on. They got the bees, and so they said New Orleans was so sinful, God had to get rid of it. And the question is, how come God ain't got rid of your house? Is your house not sinful? Is Nashville is your place not sinful? And the problem is we get in trouble trying to explain human suffering with an idea of a God that's oversimplified. God said, at the end of the day, you can make a guess, but my ways are still not your ways. Can I tell you something? There are some things that happened in your life that people blamed on something that you did. When God wants me to give you this message, it had nothing to do with you. Job teaches us that there are some things that happen in your life that is not the result of a bad crop. Sometimes it's just the result of human suffering. Look. I gotta stop right there. I gotta stop right there, but let me give it to you one more time. There are some things that happened in your life that hurt. There are some people that you lost in your life that you're still trying to figure things out about. There's still some suffering that you're still trying to figure out. What is the meaning of this? How did it happen? And the book of Job teaches us, throw out this simplified version of God. Throw out the notion that God gives us everything that we ask for. Throw out the notion that everything that we go through is a result of what God has done, is a result of what we've done, and God has given us a bad crop. There are some things that you go through that just don't make sense, and it's just a part of human suffering. And what God teaches us through the book of Job is that God can understand and can handle your questions. God is not offended by you asking questions. God's not offended by your tears. God's not offended by your moans and your groans. But also that we as a community, we as a church, need to get to the point to where we stop making God simple and realize that there are some things that happen on earth that the humans will never understand why it happens. I don't know what's going on, but I dare you to do this. I dare you to trust God until it makes sense. Look, if you're here and you need some prayer, maybe you're going through the type of suffering that we talked about. Maybe you're like Job and you're like, look, I'm losing family members. I have disease in my body. I've lost all type of property. I've lost things that I owned and that I valued. Look, maybe you're saying, look, I need some prayer because I'm about to give up on this whole idea of God, because the God that they gave me is not the God that I'm experiencing. I don't want you to give up. I want you to realize that maybe God is trying to show you a different side of him. Maybe God is trying to show you that even when things happen that can't be explained, God will still be with you in the midst of it. We're here to pray with you and for you. 629-219-2403. Text us your prayer request, your name. This is your first time and you're like, man, look, nobody really gives me the real like that. There's a lot of churches that don't give you the truth because sometimes truth leads to a slippery slope. And so if I tell you one thing, you're going to start questioning something else. Look, I'm not afraid to tell you what I don't know. I'm not afraid to give you the truth because I believe that you're mature enough to handle it. I believe our relationship and your relationship with God can handle it. And you want to say, look, I want to make this my church home. 629-219-2403. And if you'd like to become added to the church, you'd like to be baptized, we're always willing to study with you and to teach you that pattern and to allow you to put on the Lord in the water grave of baptism. 629-219-2403. And my prayer for you this week is, as you navigate suffering, as you try to figure out why all these things are happening at the same time, why there's disease and why there's problems and why all these things are happening at the same time, I dare you to continue to trust God when you can't trace God. When you can't figure out what exactly is you and what exactly is God, I dare you to trust him even when you can't trace him. And I believe that maybe God has you on a journey to where God is trying to show you that I'm bigger than whatever people have told you, and that I'll be able to hold you in the moments where you need holding. And when the right season comes, I'll be able to bless you and show you that I was with you the entire time. God bless you.